When I first heard the words, "You're not really our daughter," I thought it was a joke. I remember standing in the kitchen that afternoon holding a cup of tea, the steam touching my face like a soft warning. My mother's hands were trembling. My father wasn't even looking at me. And for a moment, everything around me, the ticking clock, the sound of cars outside, the faint smell of dinner, just stopped. I was 29 years old. I had a job I loved, a small apartment, and parents I believed were my safe place. We didn't have a perfect life, but it was ours. My mother was gentle, always humming when she cooked. My father was quiet, but his silence was warm, not cold. They were my whole world, so when that truth came out, it didn't feel real. It felt like the ground under me cracked open. She didn't say it in anger. Her voice was soft, almost shaking. "Beta," she said, "there's something you deserve to know." And I remember smiling nervously, thinking maybe it was about an illness or some family matter I wasn't aware of. But when she finally said the words, I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. "You weren't born to me." The cup slipped from my hand and broke on the floor. The sound echoed through the small kitchen. I could see the reflection of my face in the spilled tea, confused, scared, lost. My first thought wasn't even why. It was, how could this be true? All those birthdays, the late-night talks, the school events where she waited outside for me, all of it flashed before my eyes. Every memory now felt like it was asking me a question I couldn't answer. I remember whispering, "What do you mean, Mama?" And she just sat down, tears in her eyes, and said, "You were meant to know one day." But I never had the courage. In that moment, I felt like two people. The daughter who loved her parents deeply, and the stranger who suddenly didn't know who she was anymore. If someone had told me earlier that my entire identity could shift in a single sentence, I wouldn't have believed them. But that day it happened, and it changed the way I looked at everything, my family, my childhood, even my own name. That was the day I found out I wasn't their real daughter. But it took me much longer to understand what real truly means. Narration continues in first person. When I think back to my childhood, everything feels like a quiet photograph, faded but full of love. We lived in a small apartment on the second floor of a brick building in Lahore. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. I remember the smell of freshly cooked parathas every morning, and how the sound of my mother's bangles became the alarm that started my day. My father used to sit by the window, reading the newspaper, his glasses slipping down his nose. Sometimes I'd sit beside him pretending to read too, though I couldn't understand a word back then. We didn't have much, but I never felt poor. My parents worked hard to make sure of that. My mother, a school teacher, always said, "Education is your real wealth." My father ran a small printing shop near the old bazaar. His hands were always stained with ink, and he liked to joke that if I ever got lost, I'd just have to follow the smell of paper and ink to find him. I was their only child. Or at least I thought I was. I used to feel lucky. My friends had siblings they constantly fought with, but I had all the attention to myself. Every birthday was celebrated with homemade cake and laughter. My mother would take pictures with our old camera, the one that clicked loudly and sometimes refused to work. My father would sing an old tune while cutting the cake with me. There was never a single moment when I doubted that I was loved. I grew up thinking my mother was the softest person in the world. She always spoke gently, even when she was upset. She had this habit of touching my hair when she wanted to calm me down. I remember once when I failed a math test, I came home crying. Instead of scolding me, she just said, "It's okay, Beta. Failure is just a teacher in disguise." I still remember that line. I've used it so many times in my own life. My father was different, not very expressive, but deeply caring in his own quiet ways. He wasn't the kind of man who said, "I love you," but he'd fix my broken toys late at night or bring mangoes home because he knew they were my favorite. Once, I lost my school bag, and he spent his entire evening searching every corner of the neighborhood until he found it near the playground. When he returned home, tired and dusty, I hugged him so tightly that he laughed and said, "You'd think I saved your life." Looking back now, I realize I was raised with more love than many ever experience. And that's why the truth hurt so much later. In our home, Sundays were sacred. We called it Family Day. We'd cook together. Well, mostly my mother cooked while I and my father made a mess in the kitchen. After lunch, we'd watch an old movie, sitting close under the ceiling fan, with the soft sound of traffic outside. It was simple, but it felt perfect. I used to believe that nothing could ever change that. When I was about 10, I once asked my mother about my birth story. Every kid in school seemed to know theirs, how they were born in a particular hospital, how their dad fainted in the delivery room, or how their grandmother cried tears of joy. So one day while we were folding laundry, I asked her, "Mama, where was I born?" She froze for a second, then smiled. "In a small hospital near Model Town," she said quickly. "You were the tiniest baby there." I laughed and forgot about it. But years later, when I tried to find that hospital again, I couldn't. Maybe it had closed, or maybe it never existed. There were small things like that, moments that seemed ordinary, but later started to make sense in a different way. As I grew older, life got busy. I went to college, made friends, and got my first job at a marketing firm. My parents were proud. My mother cried on my first day at work as if I was leaving forever. My father gave me a diary and said, "Write your own story in this." At the time, I didn't know how literal that would become. Despite all that, there were moments when I felt different. It's hard to explain. Sometimes at family gatherings, an aunt would say, "You don't look like either of your parents." It was said casually, often followed by laughter. I'd laugh too, but a small voice in me always wondered, why do people say that so often? My complexion was fairer than both my parents. My hair was naturally straight, while my mother's was thick and curly. Even my eyes, a light brown that none of my relatives shared, often made strangers ask if I was from a different region. Once, when I was 16, I found an old photo album in my father's cupboard. Most pictures were of my childhood, birthdays, school events, holidays, but one photo stood out. It was of a baby in a white blanket lying in a hospital crib. There was no name written under it, unlike the other pictures. I asked my mother about it later, and she said softly, "That's you when you were born." But now, when I think about it, maybe it wasn't. Still, I never questioned them. Why would I? They were my parents. They were my world. When I turned 25, my mother's health began to decline. Nothing too serious at first, just fatigue and dizziness. She said it was normal, just age and stress. My father became quieter during that time. I didn't notice it then, but he started avoiding certain topics. Things about the past, family history, even old friends. I thought he was just tired. One night, I came home late from work and saw my parents sitting together in the living room. The TV was on, but no one was watching. My mother's eyes were red and my father was holding her hand. When they saw me, they stopped talking. I asked if everything was okay. My mother smiled faintly and said, "Everything's fine, Beta. Go change and eat something." It was the kind of moment that felt off but didn't make sense, like a sentence that ended too soon. In the years that followed, small cracks began to show. Old family friends stopped visiting. A few relatives would act strange around me. Once during a wedding, one of my father's cousins drunkenly said, "You're lucky, girl. Not everyone gets adopted by such good people." He laughed right after, as if it was a joke. But I felt something in my stomach tighten. I looked at my parents. My father's face went pale. My mother quickly changed the topic. That night, I asked her what he meant, and she said, "You know how people say nonsense when they drink? Ignore it," so I did, because I trusted her more than anyone in the world. Life went on. I got promoted, moved into a small apartment closer to work, and tried to make my parents proud. Every Sunday, I still visited them. My mother's health had worsened by then, and I helped her with the chores while she told me the same stories I'd heard 100 times before. I loved listening to her voice. It made me feel like home still existed. But that peace didn't last long, because a few months later, something happened that pulled the thread on everything I believed about myself. It started with a hospital visit. My mother needed some blood tests, and I offered to go with her. While filling out the forms, the nurse asked for a family blood group record. "For cross-matching," she said. I didn't know mine, so I asked my father. He said, "You're B positive like your mother." But when the results came, mine said O negative. I laughed and told the lab it must be a mistake. But they checked again. It wasn't. That's when something deep inside me began to stir. Not fear yet, but curiosity. At the time, I didn't know that this small difference in blood type would be the first step toward uncovering the biggest truth of my life. After that blood test, something changed in me. It was small at first, Like a whisper at the back of my mind I kept trying to ignore. I told myself that blood types could be confusing, that maybe my father was mistaken, or maybe I remembered wrong. But once that seed of doubt was planted, it grew quietly, finding roots in moments I had buried long ago. For days, I tried to shake it off. I went to work, met friends, laughed at office jokes, but in the quiet moments, while brushing my hair, cooking, or scrolling through my phone, that thought would return. What if they're hiding something? One evening, I went to visit my parents after work. My mother was lying on the sofa, wrapped in a shawl. My father was reading the newspaper as usual. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't stop noticing small things. The way my mother avoided my eyes when I mentioned the blood test. The way my father folded the paper too quickly, as if to avoid being asked anything. I didn't want to doubt them. They were my parents, but something inside me needed to know the truth, even if it scared me. That night after dinner, while my mother was resting, I quietly opened the drawer in her dressing table. She always kept her documents there, medical papers, bank slips, my school records. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just wanted something, anything, that would make me feel like I was overthinking. But then I found a small brown envelope. It was old, slightly torn at the edges, with my name written on it in my mother's handwriting. My heart started beating faster. I hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside, there were a few hospital documents, one of them titled Adoption Record. I froze. My hands were trembling so much that I could barely hold the paper. I read the first few lines and my vision blurred. The words didn't even seem real. It said I was adopted from a private maternity center in 1994. There was no name listed under biological parents. My first instinct was denial. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, or maybe it referred to someone else. But it had my full name, my date of birth, and even the address where my parents still lived. I closed the envelope, put everything back, and sat on the floor for a long time. I didn't cry. I just felt hollow. When my mother came into the room later, she found me sitting there quietly. She looked at me, then at the drawer. And in that instant, I knew she understood what had happened. Her lips trembled. "You found it, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. She sat down beside me, her hands reaching for mine. I wanted to pull away, but something inside me didn't let me. She looked so fragile, so small. "I was going to tell you," she said softly. "I just didn't know how." Her words floated in the air, heavy and gentle at the same time. "When?" I asked, my voice cracked. "When were you planning to tell me? When I got married? When you weren't here anymore?" She looked away, tears forming in her eyes. "We promised your real mother we'd tell you when you were old enough. But then, we fell in love with you. You became our whole life. And I couldn't bear the thought of losing you, even in your heart." I felt my throat tighten. "So you thought lying was better?" She wiped her tears and said quietly, "Sometimes love makes us cowardly." That line broke me, because I knew she wasn't wrong. I stood up, pacing the room. "Who were they?" I asked. "My real parents?" She didn't answer right away. She looked toward the window, then whispered, "Your mother was very young. She couldn't keep you. That's all I know. It wasn't enough. I wanted names, faces, reasons, but she gave me only silence. For the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything. At work, I kept making mistakes. My manager asked if I was okay. I said yes, but I wasn't. My world had tilted in a way that couldn't be fixed with logic. Everywhere I looked, I started seeing things differently. The family photos on my parents' wall felt like scenes from someone else's life. Even my childhood memories began to blur, as if they didn't belong entirely to me. One evening, I went back to their house again. My father was in the living room. My mother had gone to bed early. I sat down across from him. "Dad," I said quietly, "why didn't you ever tell me?" He folded the newspaper, placed it on the table, and looked at me with tired eyes. "Because you're my daughter," he said simply. "And I didn't want you to feel like you weren't." I wanted to be angry, but I couldn't. His voice had that same steady calmness that comforted me as a child. Still, I needed more. "Do you remember anything about them? My real parents?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Only that your mother loved you. She wanted you to have a better life. She left a note when she gave you to the clinic." "A note?" I whispered. He hesitated, then got up and walked to the cupboard. He returned with a small folded paper, yellowed with time. He handed it to me like it was something sacred. I unfolded it carefully. It was short, written in neat handwriting. It said, "Please give her to someone who will love her like their own. I cannot give her what she deserves. Tell her I loved her, even when I let her go." There was no name, no signature. Just those words. I read them again and again until they blurred into tears. For the first time, I cried, not out of anger, but out of confusion. I cried for the woman who had written those words, for the parents who raised me in silence, and for the child inside me who suddenly didn't know where she belonged. That night, I stayed up thinking about everything. The adoption papers, the note, the lies told in love. I didn't know whom to blame or if there was anyone to blame at all. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to call my mother. I needed space, not from her love, but from the truth. I spent hours walking through the city, thinking about how strange it felt that the streets I grew up on, the neighborhood that felt like mine, suddenly seemed unfamiliar. A week later, my mother called me. Her voice was weak. "Can you come home, Beta?" she asked. "There's something I want to tell you." When I arrived, she was sitting in her favorite chair near the window. Sunlight fell softly across her face. My father was beside her, holding her hand. "I wanted you to hear the whole story," she said quietly. "From the beginning." And that's when she told me everything. She said that after 10 years of marriage, she and my father couldn't have children. They tried everything. Tests, treatments, prayers. Nothing worked. One day, a friend from her school told her about a young girl at a private maternity center who had given birth and didn't want the baby. She was scared, my mother said. She didn't want the baby to grow up unloved or poor. We went to the clinic and they asked if we wanted to adopt. When I saw you for the first time, you were crying so softly, as if asking someone to hold you. And when I held you, it felt like my heart finally found its missing piece. Her eyes glistened with tears. From that moment, you were mine. I sat there, silent, absorbing every word. She continued, "We did all the paperwork. It was legal and private. We brought you home the same day. And since then, we never thought of you as anything but our own." I looked at her. This woman who had cared for me every single day of my life, who stayed up when I was sick, who cheered for me in every little success. And suddenly, anger didn't make sense anymore. What hurt wasn't that she wasn't my biological mother. What hurt was that she didn't trust me enough to share the truth sooner. I said quietly, "You should have told me, Mama. I wouldn't have loved you any less." She reached out and took my hand. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid you'd look at me differently. Afraid you'd start searching for her and forget me." Her words broke something inside me. Not trust, but the walls I had built in the last few days. I squeezed her hand gently and said, "You could never be forgotten." For the first time in weeks, we cried together. No words, no explanations, just tears that carried years of silence. Later that evening, after she fell asleep, I sat by the window and looked out at the city lights. I thought about the woman who had given me life and the one who had given me love. One gave me a beginning, the other gave me a home. And maybe, I thought, both kinds of mothers are real, just in different ways. After that night, something inside me shifted. I couldn't just let the truth sit there like a stone in my heart. I needed to know more. Not because I wanted to replace my parents, I could never do that, but because a part of me felt unfinished. I wanted to understand the story before I was born, the woman who had carried me, and the reasons that led her to let me go. My parents didn't stop me. My mother was quiet when I told her. My father just nodded and said, "If you ever find her, tell her we took good care of you." Those words stayed with me. They weren't defensive or bitter, just filled with quiet pride and love. So I began my search. I started with the only clue I had, the name of the maternity center from the adoption papers. Nassim Women's Care Clinic. When I searched online, I found nothing. No website, no listing. Maybe it had closed years ago. The next week, I took a day off work and went to the address mentioned in the papers. It was in an older part of the city, near a crowded market. When I arrived, the building was gone, replaced by a small pharmacy and a clothing store. I asked the shopkeeper if he remembered any clinic that used to be there. He scratched his head and said, "Yes, many years ago. There was a small hospital here, run by an old lady, Dr. Nassim, I think. She passed away long ago. My heart sank, but I asked, "Do you know anyone who worked there?" He thought for a moment. There was a nurse named Shazia. She used to live around the corner. But that was ages ago. That was the first real lead I had. I spent the next few days searching that neighborhood, asking people about Shazia. Most didn't remember. Some gave vague directions. Eventually, an elderly man who sold tea pointed me toward a small house with blue doors. When I knocked, a woman in her 60s opened the door. She had kind eyes and a face that carried both time and warmth. "Are you Shazia?" I asked nervously. "Yes," she said, a little cautious. "Do I know you?" I hesitated, then showed her the old adoption paper. "You used to work at this clinic, right? I think." "I was born there." Her eyes widened. She looked at the paper for a long moment, then at me. I could almost see her searching her memory. "You were adopted?" She asked softly. "Yes," I said. "In 1994. I'm trying to find my birth mother." She invited me inside. The small house smelled of tea and old books. On the wall hung pictures of her family, her children, her grandchildren. We sat at a wooden table, and she made tea as we talked. "I remember that year," she said slowly. "So many babies were born there. But there was one case that stayed with me. A young girl, maybe 17 or 18. She came alone, late at night. She didn't tell us much, only that she couldn't keep the baby. I remember she cried a lot. My heart was pounding. Do you remember her name?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, we weren't allowed to ask. It was all kept private. But I remember one thing. She gave the baby a name before she left." I leaned forward. "What name?" She looked at me carefully and said, "Amina." My breath caught. That was my middle name, Amina. The one my parents said they added because it sounded beautiful. Tears welled in my eyes. "That was me, wasn't it?" She nodded slowly. "Maybe. I can't be sure, but it sounds like it. You look like her a little. She was fair, with brown eyes like yours." I didn't know what to say. It felt like the air around me was heavier. "Do you know where she went after that?" I asked. "She left early in the morning," the nurse said. She didn't say much, but she mentioned a village near Faisalabad. That's all I remember. That tiny piece of information felt like gold. I thanked her for her time and walked out into the afternoon sun, holding that name, Faisalabad, like a fragile clue to my past. The next few days, I couldn't focus on anything else. My mind kept going back to that image of a scared young girl sitting alone in a hospital room writing that note. Who was she? What kind of life did she have after that night? Did she ever think about me? I didn't know if I was strong enough to find her, but I knew I had to try. So I planned a trip. I took a few days off work, told my parents I needed some time away, and took the train to Faisalabad. It was a quiet ride. I watched fields pass by, children running alongside the tracks, women hanging clothes on rooftops. Everything felt calm, yet my heart raced the entire time. When I arrived, I stayed in a small guest house. I didn't have much to go on. No name, no exact address, just a faint memory of what Shazia had said. I started asking around, visiting old clinics, small hospitals, even local government offices that might have kept records. Most people couldn't help, but one clerk mentioned something that made me pause. "There was a young woman back then," he said. "Came here for some paperwork. She mentioned giving birth in Lahore. Her name was Safia, Safia?" I repeated softly. He nodded. "Yes. She used to live in a nearby colony, but I don't know where she is now." That evening, I walked through that colony. Narrow lanes, children playing cricket, women chatting by doorsteps. I asked a few older residents about Safia. Most shook their heads, but one woman said, "Yes, I remember a girl named Safia. She used to live in that small house near the corner. She moved away years ago after her parents passed." "Do you know where she went?" The woman shrugged. "Last I heard, she was in Rawalpindi. Married, maybe. It's been a long time." It felt like chasing a shadow. Every answer led to another question, but I wasn't ready to stop. When I returned to my guest house that night, I sat by the window, staring at the streetlights flickering outside. I thought about how strange it was to feel so close and yet so far from the truth. I took out my phone, opened the small note my father had given me, the one my biological mother had written, and read it again. Tell her I loved her. Even when I let her go, those words felt alive now. They weren't just a message from the past. They were a voice calling out to me across time. I whispered softly, "I'm coming to find you." The next morning, I took the first bus to Rawalpindi. It was a long journey. Hours passed as the city changed outside my window. Villages turned into towns, and towns into crowded streets. I kept thinking about what I would say if I actually found her. Would she even want to see me? Would she recognize me? By the time I reached, the sun was setting. I went straight to the local records office. The clerk there looked bored but kind. When I mentioned the name Safia and the approximate year of birth, he searched for a while, then said, "There's a Safia Malik, born 1977. She lives near Sadar now." He gave me the address. I stood outside that house for almost an hour before knocking. It was small, with white walls and a garden full of marigolds. My hands were cold, my heart racing. When the door opened, a woman in her late 40s stood there. Her hair was tied in a loose bun, her eyes soft but tired. She looked at me with confusion. "Yes?" she asked gently. I could barely speak. "Are you Safia Malik?" "Yes," she said slowly. "Who are you?" I swallowed hard. My voice trembled. "I think I might be your daughter." She stared at me for a long moment. The color drained from her face. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Then tears filled her eyes. She whispered, "What did you say?" I showed her the adoption paper, the old note, and told her what I'd learned. She took the paper in her shaking hands, sat down on the step, and began to cry. "I never thought I'd see you again," she said between sobs. "Not in this life." I knelt beside her. My own tears were falling freely now. "It's really you?" She nodded, touching my face gently as if afraid I'd disappear. "I've dreamed of this moment every year on your birthday. I used to wonder if you were safe, if someone loved you." "They did," I said softly. "They loved me more than anything." She smiled weakly. "Then I did the right thing." We sat there for a long time, holding hands, crying quietly. There were no dramatic words, no loud emotions, just the quiet relief of two souls finding each other again after almost 3 decades. Later, she invited me inside. The house was simple but warm. Photos hung on the wall, her husband, and 2 grown children. My half-siblings, I realized. She told me her story that night. When she was 17, she fell in love with a man who promised to marry her. But when she got pregnant, he left. Her parents hid her pregnancy out of shame. They arranged for her to give birth in Lahore, away from home. "I wanted to keep you," she said, "but my parents wouldn't let me. I cried every day for months after that." Her voice broke. "I never stopped praying for you." Listening to her, I felt a strange calmness. Not anger, not pity, but understanding. She wasn't a villain in my story. She was just a young girl trapped by fear and circumstance. When I left that night, she hugged me tightly and said, "You were never forgotten. Amina." Not for a single day. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but at that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. Maybe family isn't just about who raises you or who gives birth to you. Maybe it's about love that survives distance, silence, and time. That night, I called my parents. My mother picked up. Her voice was soft. "Did you find her?" she asked. "Yes," I whispered. "And she's everything you said she was." There was a pause. Then she said, "Then maybe now our hearts can rest." The morning after I met my biological mother, I woke up before sunrise. The air felt lighter somehow, like the world had been holding its breath with me all this time, and now it finally exhaled. I looked out of the small guest house window at the quiet street below. For the first time in months, I didn't feel lost. I knew who I was, not just a daughter of one home, but of 2 hearts that had loved me in different ways. Safia called me that morning. Her voice was soft, still heavy from last night's emotions. "Can you come for breakfast?" she asked. I smiled. Of course. When I reached her home, she'd made parathas and tea. It felt simple, but special. A small ritual between a mother and the daughter she never got to raise. We didn't talk much while eating. We didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was peaceful. Her husband joined us later. He already knew about me. She must have told him the night before. He was quiet but kind, the sort of man who understood things without many words. He said, "You're always welcome here. Family doesn't have to fit into neat boxes." I thanked him, my throat tight. Then Safia brought out an old box. Inside were a few letters, photographs, and a tiny bracelet, faded and worn but still whole. "I bought this before you were born," she said. "I kept it all these years. I didn't know if I'd ever get to give it to you. I took it in my hand. It was small, meant for a newborn. I couldn't stop my tears. "Thank you," I whispered, "for keeping this, for remembering me." She smiled through her tears. How could I forget? We spent that day together, walking through the market, sharing stories, taking pictures. It felt like filling the empty pages of a photo album that had waited years to be complete. But even in that warmth, a quiet thought followed me. How would my adoptive parents feel? Would they think I was replacing them? That question weighed on me as I returned home a few days later. When I reached, my mother opened the door before I could even ring the bell. She just looked at me for a second, then hugged me tightly. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. She already knew. We sat down together and I told her everything. How I'd found Safia, what she said, what I felt. My mother listened silently, her eyes glistening. When I finished, she smiled faintly and said, "I always knew one day you'd want to know where you came from. I was afraid at first, that maybe you'd stop needing us. But now I see it's not about replacing love, it's about understanding it." I took her hand. "You'll always be my mother. You raised me, loved me, taught me everything. That can never change." She squeezed my hand. "And I'll always be proud that she gave you life so we could love you." That was the first time she ever said "she" without bitterness, just acceptance. Later that night, my father joined us. He didn't talk much, but as he stood up to leave the room, he said quietly, "Tell her, I'm grateful." Those 3 words meant more than any long speech could. In the weeks that followed, I began to balance both worlds. Safia and I spoke on the phone often. Sometimes we'd talk about the past, sometimes about small everyday things. Work, recipes, the weather. She'd ask about my parents, and I'd tell her how they were doing. I sent her photos from my childhood. Birthdays, school trips, family vacations. She'd reply with messages like, "You looked so happy. They gave you a good life." One evening, she called me crying. "Do you know how many nights I imagined your face? I used to look at every little girl on the street and wonder if she could be you." I didn't know how to comfort her. So I just said softly, "You don't have to wonder anymore." A few months later, I invited Safia to visit my parents. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, bringing together 2 women who shared a daughter but had lived entirely separate lives. When she arrived, my mother greeted her politely at first. They both looked nervous. I introduced them and stepped back, letting them find their own way. After a long pause, Safia said, "Thank you for everything you did for her." My mother replied gently, "Thank you for giving her to us." And just like that, the tension softened. They sat down for tea. By the end of the afternoon, they were sharing stories. How I refused to eat vegetables as a child, how I loved to draw, how I always hummed while doing homework. It felt like 2 halves of my story finally met in one room. When Safia left that evening, she hugged my mother and said, "You did an amazing job." My mother smiled. We both did. In the months that followed, my life began to feel whole again. I visited Safia's family sometimes, met my half-siblings, got to know them slowly. It wasn't instant closeness, but it was genuine. There were still moments of awkwardness, of silence. But that's how healing works. Not in one big moment, but through quiet steps. One day, I asked Safia if she ever forgave herself for letting me go. She looked down and said, "I don't think a mother ever fully forgives herself. But when I saw the woman you've become, I felt peace." Maybe that's forgiveness in its own way. That line stayed with me. Maybe forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about learning to live with it kindly. As time passed, I started journaling about everything. The confusion, the pain, the peace, the gratitude. Writing helped me see that this journey wasn't just about finding my biological mother. It was about finding myself. I used to think identity came from knowing where you belong. But now I understand. It comes from knowing you are loved, no matter where you started. Sometimes when I sit with my parents, my mom knitting beside me, my dad watching TV, I catch myself smiling. Because I know, without a doubt, that they were never my adoptive parents. They were just my parents. And when I call Safia on weekends, I feel the same way. She's not just my biological mother. She's a part of me, the beginning of my story, Love doesn't have to choose sides. It just grows to fit everyone it needs to. Last year, on my birthday, I invited everyone, both families, for dinner. It was simple: homemade food, laughter, stories. At one point, I looked around the table. My parents were chatting with Safia's husband. My two mothers were laughing together about something I'd done as a child. In that moment, I realized I wasn't broken between two lives. I was complete because of both. After everyone left, my mother came to me, kissed my forehead, and said, "You were always meant for us." Maybe this was God's way of giving us all something to love. That night, as I blew out the candles, I didn't make a wish. I didn't need to. Everything I'd ever searched for was already sitting around that table. If I could go back and talk to the younger me, the girl who cried in the park after finding out she was adopted, I'd tell her this: you are not a mistake. You are the result of two acts of love, one that gave you life and one that gave you a home. Sometimes life hides your truth so you can grow strong enough to face it when the time is right. And when you do, it doesn't break you. It sets you free. Now, when people ask me about my parents, I smile and say, I'm lucky. I have two mothers. One gave me roots. The other gave me wings.